Women are often told that they are less than in the church, but we believe the Bible tells a different story.
Nunnally argues that male headship in the church is a myth, that the Bible never says that the man is the head of the household, and that the idea the husband is to lead his wife is actually unbiblical. In her view, when Paul talks about Christ being head of the church, that actually has nothing to do with leadership or authority, but with love, sacrifice, death, and giving of life. She argues that when Paul calls the man the head of the wife, this refers only to giving himself up for her, sacrificing for her to give her a flourishing life. Now, she, of course, concedes that Jesus did lead and have authority over others, but she claims that these are not traits that husbands are meant to imitate as they imitate the headship of Christ. Instead, she says, the husband's headship is a servant role, not a leadership role. First, let's be clear. The biblical texts really are dealing with authority and submission. Paul says wives are to be subject to their husband. Now, St. Peter says the same thing, and the two of them use the same Greek word, hypotasso, to describe that relationship. Now, that word comes from military usage. It originally referred to the troops under the authority of an officer, but it came to be used more broadly for anybody under the authority of anybody else, whether that's demons being cast out in the name of Jesus by an exorcist, or the subjects of the Roman Empire being under their political authorities, or even us submitting to God. So we're very clearly dealing with the themes of authority and submission. Hypotasso is a pretty broad term. On its own, it doesn't tell us just what the nature of that authority or that submission looks like. It's used for everything from like a master-slave dynamic to simply respecting your elders. But fortunately, Paul gives us the key to make sense of his teaching in Ephesians 5, because immediately, like a verse before calling upon wives to submit to their husbands in verse 22, he says in verse 21 that we are to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. And you know what verb he uses there? Hypotasso. So as Pope St. John Paul II observes, when Paul speaks of the mutual subjection of the spouses, husband and wife, he's giving us the framework for the words that follow on the subjection of the wife to the husband. And he's showing us that we're not dealing with a question of one-sided domination. So before we can make sense of male headship in the marriage, we first need to understand the Christian vision of power and leadership and service and submission. As Jesus tells the apostles at the Last Supper, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. And he points to himself as the model, saying, I am among you as one who serves. So if your image of male headship is one in which the husband lords his authority over his wife, well, that's precisely the model of leadership that Jesus tells us not to follow. On the other hand, this is what strikes me about Nunnally's argument, in which she claims that the husband's headship is a servant role, not a leadership one. From a Christian perspective, a leadership role is a service role. So men are called to be servant leaders to their wives in some way. Does that mean then that wives just shut up and go along with whatever the men decide? It does not. Submission in the biblical sense here doesn't mean you just turn your mind off and shut up and put up, go along with whatever they tell you to do. After all, we don't do that even in our submission to God.